Hello there, thanks for joining me. In this week's video I'm going to go through the editing process I used to work on the images that I took in last week's video. Now if you've not seen last week's video, I'll put a link hopefully up here somewhere, or if not it'll be down in the comments below, so you might want to watch that first and just look at how I caught those images and what I did. It was where I went in the woodland as the fog had descended. So I had a couple of direct messages on Instagram asking me about the developing process, about the editing process that I used. So what I figured I'd do is I'll do a video for you. Now, if you're not following me on Instagram, I'll put a link in the description below. You can follow me on there, and if you have any questions or anything, by all means feel free to drop me a DM, or even better, leave a comment on this video, and if I can I'll come back to you as soon as I can and fill you in on that. So without further pontification or procrastination, I'll go into how I edit the photographs. First thing I do, I take the SD card from the camera and using a Lightning to SD card dongle, plug it into the iPad, and I upload them into the Photos app, which I use for the initial import. What that allows me to do is to go through the images, cull out any images that I'm not happy with, anywhere it's slightly out of focus or the ones that I don't think will work. And it's quite handy that if I've actually bracketed the images, then what I'm able to do is select the favourites, the ones that I decide that I want to work on, and then that way any that are overexposed don't get imported into Lightroom. So once I've gone through the images I want to keep, mark them with a favourite, the little love heart there that you get on the iPad, and that narrows down it when I'm going into Lightroom to import them. So once I've gone into the Photos app and done that, I go into Lightroom, and once I'm in Lightroom I create a folder, which on this one we named it Woodland Fog, and I imported the images that I thought might be worth featuring in the video on this one. Right, so this is one of the compositions that I talked you through earlier, where we, on the last video, you saw me there compose it, narrow down the field of view and decide what I was going to include and exclude from the shot. So I've got the two oak trees. It's actually probably one tree that's broke out into a nice fork. And I always find that fork trees give something of a point of interest. They're always just something a little bit away from the norm, so it's just something that you can focus on. If you're ever struggling for a woodland composition, a fork tree is always worth looking out for. Then I've got the silver birch there and there, so we'll go to the original. Okay, so I've got the image in Lightroom, and as I've got in there, let's have a look. So I'm looking at it now. The greens coming through are quite striking, and they seem somewhat an imbalance with the rest of the muted tones. So what I've done is I've gone in for the camera profile. I usually start with the camera profile. That allows me to decide how I want the image to look once I've gone through the editing process. So on something like a nice sunny day out in rural landscape, something like a vivid profile might be the one to go for, or even the landscape, especially if wanting to bring out the nice blue skies and the greens of the fields. But on this occasion, it's quite a flat profile because it is quite a muted tones. So if we go in for a flat profile and we'll look at light, what do we need to do? Well, there's no shadow detail lost anywhere. So what I'll do is I'll just put, although it's a flat scene, I want to just up the contrast a little bit, so I'll give it a little bit more contrast, just to give that definition there between the shape. There's a lot of detail in the bark that I want to bring out. I'll knock the highlights back a little bit, and I'll just raise the shadows up ever so slightly. It just helps flatten the whole scene out, even though I've put some contrast in there for the details. At the top of the frame, around this area, it does seem to be that there's a little bit of light there leaching out of the frame. So what I'm going to do, before I get any further distracted, I'm going to go to the cropping tool. And as I knew it was going onto the video, I elected for a 16:9 crop. This is something I do a lot. I always have a tendency to go towards 16:9s. I do quite like that aspect ratio, especially for woodland photography. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to centre it there. I've got plenty of foreground interest, and I've got plenty of depth there going back, and it just allows me to take out the top of the frame where all the the sky's peeking in. So I've done that. So I lift the black slightly, and I'm just going to have a look at the tone curve. So just to enhance that, I'm just going to lift the black slightly, come down the whites a little bit, and I'm just going to bring down the shadows ever so slightly and just raise the highlights. It's a very gentle S-curve that should just increase that contrast a little bit. Any more, it might just lose that ethereal feel. So we'll come out of the S-curve and let's have a look at the colours. Now, as shot it was 6400 Kelvin. Let's have a look. I'm just going to have a look at the daylight settings and see which looks right, because it's a foggy day. It had quite a cool feel to it, but there's a lot of autumn colours there. So I'll go for the shade, and that shade gives it a bit of a warming feeling. It's possibly too warm, so I'm going to go back to the cloudy. I think that's what we'll go for. Now, one of the things I do tend to do is I like to boost the vibrance a little bit, but I also like to drop back the saturation, usually by an equal amount. And as I'm looking at the scene now, it's looking, well, yeah, it's not looking too bad, but the greens are a little bit overpowering. So I'm going to go into the colour mix. I'm going to go into the greens, into the green panel. And I'm going to move the greens towards the yellow slightly. Probably a little bit more. Just going to knock back the saturation slightly. And because some of the leaves are a little bit wet, they're quite bright, and I just want those to be toned down slightly, so I'm just going to go back on the luminance a little bit. Just knock the luminance down ever so slightly. What we've done there is we've muted those colours. Now what that allows me to do is with the yellows, because I brought the greens towards the yellows, I can move the yellows a little bit more towards the oranges. I'm just going to move the yellows more towards the oranges. I'm going to boost that saturation because I want to bring those autumn colours through where we've got them. I'm just going to boost them a little bit, but I'm going to leave the luminance alone. So let's move on to the effects. I'm not going to go into any split toning or colour grading on this one. And again, for the details on the bark, when you zoom in and look at the bark texture on there, I just want to boost that. So you can see all those little imperfections in the bark, all the little where the silver birch has started to break up and spread as it's got older. It's always quite an interesting texture is silver birch. So we'll go up. I always look around 30 in the textures. So let's come back to the overall scene. I'm just going to knock the clarity back a little bit. It just allows for that separation that we've got built in. I'm just going to knock the clarity back to about 15. And the DAs, again, normally DAs is a great way of bringing out colours and details in clouds. But on this one in a woodland, especially with the fog, I just want to make the most of that dehaze. So I'm just going to use negative dehaze. That allows there for that little bit of softness to permeate through. And just to focus the eyes a little bit on the image, I'm just going to put something of a vignette on. It's quite a strong vignette at 20, but because it's quite a muted scene, and because there's no sky in there, it's not obviously vignetted. Now what I will do is I'll just go into the optics. I'll remove the chromatic aberration, but I don't think there is any. Lens correction. Now this is an interesting one. If I turn it on, turn it off. For this image, I think I prefer it off. So I'm going to leave that off. Now, do I need to do any local adjustments on that one? Do you know what? I don't think I do. So that's, yeah, I think that's the image that I'll be happy to use. So as I came out of the wood and the fog started to lift, one that has been quite well received is this image here. This is the one looking up the track with the curve. I think why this works is that you've got the prominent trees there, creating a natural boundary to the left hand side of the frame. That stops your eye going leading out to the left, and then actually on the track they're going through, takes you around and leads your eye into the scene itself and down the track. Not to mention the fact that you've got some gorgeous autumnal colours. And first of all, you can see the shadows are quite dark. So let's have a look. I think we're going to go for a flat profile on this one. That helps lift the shadows and it just gives us a little bit more dynamic range to play with. If we'd gone for a vivid, it would be quite ghastly in some respects. As with the last landscape, I'll be having to really tone down those colours. But on this one I just felt like a flat profile was the way to go. So again, looking at the histogram, it's very much loaded to the left hand side. So we're going to the light profile, into the light, and we're just going to lift the blacks ever so slightly. Just going to pull down the shadows, pull down the whites, and just ever so slightly lift the highlights. And just close that down. Let's have a look full screen. That's not looking too bad. I just want a little bit more contrast, so I'm just going to boost it up on the sliders. I'm just going to pull the highlights down, and I'm just going to lift those shadows a little bit more. Just take a little bit more off the blacks. That's looking somewhere a little bit more like it. Let's move down to the colour. A little bit cloudy, so I'm just going to, it was a cloudy day, the sun was starting to burn through, but it was still cloudy. It wasn't dull, but it was certainly cloudy, so I'm going to go for a cloudy colour on the white balance. And what I'm going to do again is just boost the vibrance slightly and knock back the saturation. I think that should do us. The greens, again, at this time of year, just seem to be a little bit distracted, and people always associate autumn with oranges and what have you. So we're going to go to the greens. We're just going to knock the greens back ever so slightly, just so they're not as vibrant. Maybe knock the saturation back as well. And I think I'm going to leave the luminance where it is. Going to the yellows again. People are expecting the sort of oranges and yellows, so we're just going to boost the saturation on that. I'm going to go into the oranges, and again, I'm not going to move the hue slider on this one, but I'm certainly going to boost the saturation. I want to get those autumnal colours coming through. That's very much how I remember the day, is that there was a lot of oranges and yellows in the scene. So looking at that, that's looking somewhere near on the colours. Let's have a look at the effects. One of the things I do a lot in my photographs is I do boost the texture. So if we look at the tree, there's some great bark detail on that oak tree. So I just want to bring that out. That's looking better. So zoom back out, and overall what I tend to do, I'm just going to knock the clarity back. It was still quite a subdued day. There was still a little bit of mist and atmosphere in the air. So just knock that clarity back a little bit. And I'm just going to go back and put a little bit more haze into it. So I'm using a negative dehaze of -15. And just to keep your eye in the scene, I'm just going to use that vignette. And I think that'll do us. I'm just wondering if we need to put any local adjustments on there. You know what? I still think it's a little bit dark in the shadows. So what I'm going to do, go back into the light panel, and I'm just going to lift the shadows ever so slightly. In fact, probably more than what I realised. Yeah, I'm up at 55. One of the little tips for Lightroom is if you just touch either end of the slider, for each touch it goes up an increment of 5 units. So it's a good way just to increasing it in steps, and you can, if you're sort of between the two, then you can just fine tune it back in, and if you want to reset it, you can just double tap it. So let's go back to the crop, because this is going to be used on the video. So again, back to a 16:9 crop, and I want to keep the base of the tree in the frame, so I'm going to keep it down. Yeah, I'm going to keep it down and just crop out the top part of the sky, that if anything's likely to be a bit distracting. And then you've got the natural arc of the tree there that's going to keep it in. So I think that'll do as a crop. My eye's drawn out slightly with this area there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a localized adjustment on that one. So what I've done there is I've just brought in, I've lowered the exposure about 1/3 of a stop and decreased the contrast, and not about the highlights as well, just to stop your eye falling out of the frame. I'm going to take you on to the this one. Yeah, we'll go for this one, yeah, and show you what I've done with this one. So on this image, I went for the flat profile. Again, there was atmosphere resting in the air, and if we'd have put something like a landscape on, it would have been too dark in the shadows. We really would have had to, boost the shadows to get the definition out there. So just use a flat profile. And what I've done in light is I've brought back the highlights. I've boosted the contrast 20. Again, because you've got the bands of light coming through the trees, you've got areas of light and shade, and by boosting the contrast slightly, that helps give that definition. Now with the highlights, if I left it at its natural, it was 0 value, it would have been a little bit overpowering. So that's why I went back and I just knocked the highlights back ever so slightly. And same with the shadows. If I'd left the shadows at a zero value, it would have been quite dark. But by boosting the shadows, it just allows a little bit of air into the scene. It allows the light to come through. One of the things to note is that it's very rare that I will take the shadows above 75. I find if you start to go above 75, for me it just feels like you're just pulling it a little bit too far. So I keep it to around 75 on either end of the scale, unless I'm really wanting to lose the back. If I'm wanting to lose the dark spaces and actually make a really high contrast image, then I might really shut out the shadows. But on the whole, for a scene that I want to appear natural, then I generally keep the shadows to around 75. And the whites and blacks I've not touched. Again, I've used the tone curve to boost the contrast there by putting a gentle S on, lifting the blacks and lowering down the whites. And the colour, very much in shade because I'm under the trees. So I've put it under shade, and that's just give it a nice warm feeling. It was getting around 11 o'clock when I took this, and subsequently the atmosphere was starting to feel a little bit warmer than what I had done earlier. Earlier on in the day it was quite a cool feel, and quite a cold feel to the wood, but as the sun was coming through it felt quite warm. So I'm happy to go for the shade and boost the colour temperature, and it's just making the oranges come through a little. I've boosted the vibrance and I've taken down the saturation. In the colour mix, I've boosted the saturation of the oranges. I've moved the yellow slightly more towards the orange and boosted the saturation. And on the greens is where I've made the greatest impact. I've taken the hue down to -35. I've desaturated the greens and I've taken the luminous down. the moisture that was in the air had sort of settled on a lot of these leaves, and even though I was using a polarizing filter, there was still a lot of reflection coming off there. So what I've done is I've taken down the luminance just to settle down these greens and stop them being too distracting in the scene. The scene for me is very much about the light coming through the trees and the overall feeling that you get on the day. So going into the effects, I've done my usual trick. I have boosted the texture to 30. It's one of the things I tend to do in most of my images where I want some definition in there. I boost the texture to 30. I've taken the clarity down and taken the DAs down, and again I've put a vignette on there just to shape it. And in terms of local adjustments, I've not had to do anything. The scene was very much as it was. So that's the scene as I've left it. I hope this video has been helpful for you. I hope it's answered one or two of your questions, and I hope it's inspired you to get out there and take some of your own images. It's worth noting that the photographs I've taken were all taken using a Nikon camera, and I've shot in a raw profile. And using a raw profile, it gives you the scope to develop the images in the way that I have. If you've any questions, by all means drop me a comment, and if you've got this far in the video, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mind subscribing. There'll be a button somewhere down below. Throw me a like if you've enjoyed it. Throw me a thumbs down if you haven't, but by all means leave me a comment and let me know why, and I will look to do another video sometime around this time next week. So thanks for watching. You take care, and don't forget, have fun.